Hello, welcome to our first online class. I really miss you. That's the first thing that I need to tell you. I really miss you all. I miss your noise. I miss your questions. I miss your energy. I miss everything about the moments that we have together. So, the first thing I want to tell you is I am really looking forward to seeing you as soon as I can. And I really, really miss you. And I really hope you are doing well, that you're dealing well with everything that's going on. And I promise that we're going to see each other in no time. Well, considering that we have to keep up with our studies because we're not on vacation, and we know that, I want to start our class with, or actually retaking the topic that we were discussing previously, which is war. So, first of all, we studied about the United Nations, what it is, what it works with, the main organs of the United Nations. And remember that I told you that there are two main organs in the United Nations? Not that the other ones are not important or not as important, but these are the ones that do most of the job. So the General Assembly, which is the organ responsible for discussing the issues of the countries, finding new solutions to problems, voting for many of the other organs and roles in the United Nations. And the other one is the Security Council. So the Security Council, as you have studied and we have discussed, is the organ responsible for keeping the peace, or if the peace is not there anymore, trying to bring it back somehow. So the opposite of peace, which is also something that we discussed in class, is conflict. But what is conflict itself? So conflict happens where human relations happen. Not only human relations, but let's focus on the human part here. So I brought you a definition from Cambridge Dictionary, which is a dictionary that I like very much. So take a look at this Cambridge definition here. First of all, it says that conflict is an active disagreement between people with opposing opinions or principles. What does it mean? A very, very, very simple example. I root for a certain soccer team, and my best friend roots for a certain soccer team, and these two teams are going to engage in a match. So we are certainly going to have a conflict because we have two different opinions. What are our two different opinions? I want my team to win, and she wants her team to win. So this is basically one of the types of conflict. An example sentence that the dictionary says or gives us is, there was a lot of conflict between him and his father. So why was that so? Because they had different opinions or different principles, and they couldn't be tolerant with each other. So conflict has much to do with tolerance or intolerance in this case. The second definition is more related to what we want here, which is fighting between two or more groups of people or countries. So here, for example, when we have countries that want the same, but the same cannot be shared between these two countries, they are probably going to have a conflict. The conflict can be armed or not, it can be violent or not, but there is a disagreement between the parts. So this is really a really important concept. We are going to, another example that the dictionary gives us is, we wish to avoid conflict between our countries, if at all possible, which is basically the reason why the United Nations exists. How can we better understand conflicts? How can we better analyze the conflicts? Because there are many different types of conflicts, there are many different reasons for conflicts to happen, there are many ways of solving a conflict. So I like to work with the concept of dimensions of a conflict, because you can see the conflict through different types of perspectives, And you can also blend these perspectives when you are analyzing a certain type of conflict or a certain type of war, which is something that you guys are going to do in no time. So what is it about? This little map shows here the different kinds of peacekeeping operations from the United Nations, which is not going to be our focus right now because first of all we have to understand what a conflict is about before we can understand how the United Nations tries to solve or deal with these issues. So, the 5 dimensions of a conflict try to put into perspective. So what does it say? The 5 dimensions of conflict chart a typical conflict, whether it is interpersonal or global. Do you guys remember in the beginning of the class that I said that conflicts are whenever or wherever human relations are? This is basically what it is about. So you can have a conflict with a best friend, you can have a conflict with a colleague, you can have a conflict with a teacher, a parent, and you as a country can also have a conflict with your people sometimes. You can have a conflict with another country. There can be a conflict within your country between 2 different groups of interest. So how can we understand conflict? It's so complicated, it's so complex. Let's try to make it simpler. The first dimension, the first thing that you have to analyze is who and how many parties are involved in this country. What is a party, Ms.Mayara? It's like, woo-hoo! Oh, a party is a group of people or the members in a group of people. This is why a celebration is usually called party, because there is a group of people together. That's why it's called a party. A political party, for example, is a group of people who engage politically. So the first dimension is who and how many people or countries are involved in this conflict. So who and how many? The conflict can be internal. Internal conflict is a conflict within oneself. Imagine that you are eager to eat that last piece of chocolate that you have in your fridge, but you know that you are on a diet and you have already eaten chocolate this week. So, oh my God, should I stay or should I go? This is an internal conflict. So, internal conflict is mainly a conflict inside your mind. So, we usually have this, and it's really good when we solve them, but sometimes it's hard as well. And the conflict can be interpersonal. An interpersonal conflict, as we can see here, is a conflict between 2 or more individuals. And here we have a conflict mostly of interests. It's the case of the friend who roots for a different soccer team that I told you before. This is interpersonal conflict. So imagine now that you and your brother want that delicious last piece of chocolate. This is interpersonal because you have the same interest, but there's only one piece of chocolate. How can you solve this conflict? We can also have an intra-group conflict. What is this? It's a conflict within a group. So remember when the teacher sets a task and the teacher divides you into groups, but the teacher doesn't allow you to choose the members of the group, and then you have to work with those people you don't really like much, you are not too much into them, and there's always that person that wants to be a leader, there's always the person who is more introverted. So the conflict is within a group, so within an organization, within a group of members for a school assignment, within a family as well. So this type of conflict involves a group specifically. It's not single people together that have different interests, but a group that should be working and it's not working properly. Then we have an intergroup conflict. So intra is inside of the group, and inter is between 2 different groups or even among different groups. So Imagine that you are participating in school championship, and there are many groups that represent different countries, for example, and you all want the same thing. Each group wants to be the winner. And this is exactly what an intergroup conflict is, because you are going to start teasing each other, you're going to start provoking each other a little bit, you're going to try to let those people down in order to show that you are better. And things that happen in competitions, we all know that these things happen. So this is something that happens, for instance, in an intergroup conflict. So we have different groups that usually either want the same thing or they have a very different kind of opinion, and they start a conflict or a discussion, an argument, and sometimes even war, armed or not. Then we have an international conflict, which is a conflict between two nations or a conflict among more nations. So international conflicts are usually those wars that we hear about, those wars that we watch the news about, and they involve at least two or more countries. So this is an international conflict. This is something that you quite know about. And a global conflict, different from the international one, is a conflict that affects most of the world. So even though the other countries from the globe are not directly involved in this conflict, they are somehow affected by this conflict. So whenever there is tension, for example, between the United States and North Korea, the whole globe is affected, because both countries are very influential. They have a lot of power. So that means that in this case, most of the world is going to be affected, even though we're not directly interacting in the conflict. And a transboundary is a conflict that involves boundaries, which means the limits or borders of a country. A very common case of a conflict like this is the Palestine-Israel conflict that involves territory, and both states, both nations claim they have right to their territory. So it is different from an international conflict, because in this case there is not an interest in boundaries necessarily. But if you analyze the maps of Palestine and Israel throughout the years of the conflict, you will see that both countries have changed. So that means that this is a transboundary conflict, because it changes the structure of the countries themselves. So this is the first part of it. This is the first dimension of conflicts that we have. And these are some words related to conflict, as you can see here. So the second dimension is regarding sources of conflict. So let's try to remember a little bit. We have the first dimension of conflict, which is who and how many. And it starts from the most basic one, which is a conflict from a person with themselves, up to a conflict that transcends the boundaries of countries. So we have many stages and levels, and also different numbers of people and countries involved. And the second one is the reason why conflict happens. So coming back to what I told you before, conflict is wherever human relations are, right? But the reasons why they occur are very different. For example, if we are comparing the Syrian war to the Cold War, there are many differences that are essential differences between these two conflicts. But how do we know that? One of them is that they have different origins, and the second one is that they have different reasons to why they happen. So it's very, very important to analyze the sources of the conflict. So reasons for conflicts to happen. First of all, we can have conflicts over resources. This was very, very common. If you come back to some centuries ago, in which the countries were expanding, and they, especially countries in Europe, they didn't have the necessary resources. like basic resources like wood, stone, what else? Wood, stone, food, land to harvest, crops. So all these things are resources. Water is a very important resource as well. There are conflicts happening nowadays over water. So this is a conflict over resources. Why? Because maybe they want the same resources because they don't have them. Secondly, right to claim these resources because the boundaries are not so clear. And also, thirdly, which is taking someone else's resources, which is what really happened to Europe for many, many centuries while the countries were being created and national identity was being created as well. But we can also have conflicts over values. If you take a look, for instance, at the Israel-Palestine conflict, it is not necessarily a conflict over resources. It is more a conflict over basically ideology or also religion as well, because they have different perspectives on what is right and what is wrong. So conflicts over values happen usually because the countries have deeply, but it's deeply, very, 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 very different beliefs or values over what is right and what is wrong, the country's structure, the politics, economy, religion. So coming back again, imagine you and this friend of yours, if you root for the same soccer team and your soccer team is going to have the last match in the championship, you are going to have a conflict over values because for some reason there's not a specific reason for me to root for the team that I do. So for some reason you believe that team is better and your friend believes that the other team is better, and you are going to argue and you are maybe going to have a conflict, especially if one of the sides win. And one of the sides is going to win. So you are going to have this conflict, and this is a conflict over values because this is something deep within your soul. It's something that you believe very strongly. And this is one of the main reasons people argue about nowadays, actually, because they don't have tolerance over differences. So this is a very complicated thing. But there is also conflict over psychological needs. What does it mean? It means that one person, usually one person or a leader or a group of interest, wants to take power and control. This is something, for example, that happened in Syria. The conflict in Syria was a conflict over many things, but mostly over the power over the country. So it was a conflict inside of the country, it was a national conflict mostly, but it was over psychological needs because the leaders of the groups and the current president, they all wanted to take control of the country using all means necessary. So another way, need for respect, love, affirmation, approval, friendship, and power over one. So this kind of conflict can happen from the internal to the transboundary conflict. There is no difference whatsoever. And this is an example of conflicts over resources. There have been many conflicts over oil in the world, especially in the beginning of the year 2000s, because it's a very valuable resource and also a very scarce resource, so we cannot find oil everywhere, unfortunately. Sudan is another example. The conflict in South Sudan, which is a very violent and sad conflict, mostly occurred due to resource. The resource, the same one, oil. So this is a picture of one of the South Sudanese soldiers. Well, and then we have the third dimension of the conflict, which is the difference between is or involves two people or things, and among involves a group of things. So between or among the conflicting parties. So what is a relationship? First of all, what kind of climate is present in this conflict? And how can the climate change the outcome? So this is really important. Sometimes a conflict can be solved before war happens. There is a difference between conflict and war, and we usually have conflict before we have war. It's very important to remember that. So, for example, is this relationship trusting or suspicious, friendly or hostile, open or resistant? So sometimes countries are more open and the other countries are more closed to it, calm or tense. And do parties come to the conflict with equal power? This is also really important because, for example, if one of the parties if one of the parties has an atomic bomb, there is no way to compare both sides of the possible war or the conflict because one of them has much more power. And it can also be economic power as well. So if the country is much richer. Does any party control the resources and decision-making process? It really happens with countries that are more powerful. So if the country somehow has control over the conflicting country or party, what is the degree of interdependence between the conflicting parties as well? So how much do the countries depend or rely on each other? For example, imagine that I am having a conflict with a country that is mostly my supplier of food. Of course, the conflict is going to be much better for my provider because they hold some kind of power. And how well do the parties know one another? It's also important because if you know your enemy, you sort of know what to expect from them. This is one of examples of conflicts. I think either part could or would like to control or dominate the other, but they know each other well. So the United States know the difference, know the possible effects of having an armed conflict with North Korea, and North Korea the same. So this is why there is also this tension between both parties, but they still have somehow some sort of conversation because they know that they are equally powerful in some areas, but North Korea knows, for instance, that the United States are much more economically powerful than them, so they do not try to do something. And the same goes for the United States. The United States doesn't know everything about how powerful or how armed North Korea is. So this is why they don't make a move, and they always keep the tension under control. The fourth dimension is the history of this conflict. So is this a new conflict or is this an old conflict? Think about new and old conflicts that you have ever heard about. So the history of the conflict. Some factors that can complicate it. Duration, frequency, because sometimes there is a conflict here, it stops for a while, there is a withdrawal for a while, but then it comes back, it emerges again. It has happened to Sudan many times. And the intensity of the conflict is another problem, because if the conflict is too violent, if many people have died, this complicates the possible solutions to the conflict as well. So how life-threatening the conflict is, how many people have been affected, how many people have been killed. And this is the example of Syria, for instance, which has been a very violent conflict. And this is another example. The history of Israel and Palestine conflict has been happening for almost 100 years. And there are some points in which they both stop for a while, but they always re-emerge somehow with some degree of intensity. So this is really complicated because the trust between the parties is almost inexistent. And finally, the fifth dimension is, okay, there is a conflict, but how do we deal with it? How are we possibly going to solve the conflict? Well, dealing with a conflict. From the internal conflict, which is you and yourself, to the interpersonal conflict, intergroup conflict, intragroup conflict, international conflict, transboundary conflict, all of them have to be dealt with or else they run out of control. So in every conflict, all parties try their best to take action. The action may be spontaneous or calculated, constructive or destructive, and they can happen in many ways. For example, you can avoid a conflict. No, let's not think about it, which is something that people tend to do most of the times. We can try to diffuse the conflict, which is postpone it, wait to see what happens, gather data so that we can have more information about it, or engage in the conflict. And the methods can be many. If you engage in a conflict, you get into it. So it can be by direct force of competition, accommodation, you try to adapt to it or adjust to it, compromise, or use collaborative problem solving. So, for example, when we try you to work in groups, this is exactly what we want you to do. So we know the conflict's going to happen, we know it's going to emerge in internal levels, interpersonal levels, intragroup levels, sometimes intergroup levels, but the main goal is to have them collaborative problems solved. So this is, for example, what the United Nations tries to do with most conflicts. This is why the General Assembly exists, and this is also why, because we know that not all the times are we going to have the problem solved in a good way. So this is also the reason why the Security Council exists, because sometimes we have to use direct force. And even though it's something that nobody actually wants it to happen, we know that sometimes it will, unfortunately. So what I want you to do right now is reflect upon all these dimensions of conflict that I have shown you. You are going to have access to this presentation as well, because I have prepared it especially for you. And you are going to choose a conflict, an ongoing conflict or a conflict that has already been solved, and you are going to analyze this conflict through these perspectives. And you are going to give your opinion on how you think the problem was solved, if the conflict was solved, or how you think it should be solved if it is an ongoing conflict. And by conflict in this case, I specifically mean wars. So wars between countries, civil wars, global wars, transboundary wars. You are going to choose one, and you are going to analyze these wars by these dimensions. Are we good? I know that I have talked for quite a lot, and the good part of the video is that you can come back, go forward, you can do pretty much whatever you want. If you have any doubts on what I said in the video, if you have questions about any specific terms, anything you didn't understand, please do not hesitate in contacting me, okay? And I really hope you have enjoyed this class, because it has been a pleasure to be able to teach you something again. And again, I'm really looking forward to seeing you all guys as soon as possible. Love you.